But we begin tonight with the shocking shooting this afternoon at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. Authorities say the shooter was James Von Brunn, an 88-year-old vocally anti-Semitic white supremacist, an ex-convict who was well known both to the authorities and to those who track the white supremacist movement specifically. He reportedly walked into the museum just before 1 o'clock this afternoon Eastern Time and opened fire in the entryway to the museum. Security guards apparently returned fire and critically injured Mr. Von Brunn, but not before a shot of his fatally wounded Stephen Tyrone Johns, a security guard who had worked at the museum for 6 years. Mr. Johns was pronounced dead at a hospital hours after the shooting. James Von Brunn has an arrest record and a public paper trail indicative of a dedication to anti-Semitic, anti-government, right-wing extremist causes. He was the proprietor of a website called The Holy Western Empire, which propounded his ideas and conspiracy theories. He self-published a book called Kill the Best Gentiles, the Racialist Guide for the Preservation and Nurture of the White Gene Pool. A typical excerpt is of a character that will be familiar to anyone who's ever spent any time in the dank little Nazi corners of the internet. Forgive me, I will quote from it briefly. Here is the grist underlying the Jews' goal to rule the world, garner its wealth, and enslave the Gentiles. It is the Luciferian credo that is changing the United States into an Illuminati-controlled non-white nation, soon to become part of one mongrel world. And yes, all the "I want to make it obvious that I'm insane" capitalization in that excerpt is as written originally by Mr. Von Brunn. He goes on to say that it is the Jews who have created the myth that Thomas Jefferson said all men were created equal. He praises Hitler explicitly. He denies the Holocaust. He derives complex conspiracies about World War I and World War II in Germany that are all derived from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is a white supremacist anti-Semitic standard text that is a fraud and that was debunked as such decades ago, but it still circulates in many, many languages. In addition to Mr. Von Brunn's book, you can also still find online, bearing Mr. Von Brunn's byline, an essay titled Hitler's Worst Mistake. He Didn't Gas the Jews. In the essay, Von Brunn calls America, quote, a third world racial garbage dump. James Von Brunn also posted an article last year arguing that then-candidate Barack Obama hadn't provided sufficient documentation to prove that he was born in the United States, and that therefore Obama must have been sent by someone. We also know that James Von Brunn was convicted of attempted armed kidnapping, among other things, after a 1981 incident in which he was caught inside the Federal Reserve Board headquarters carrying a revolver, a sawed-off shotgun, and a knife. Mr. Von Brunn said that he was trying to place members of the Federal Reserve Board under citizen's arrest for treason. In a bio he apparently wrote about himself on his website, he says of that crime, quote, convicted by a Negro jury, Jew-Negro attorneys, and sentenced to prison for 11 years by a Jew judge. A Jew-Negro white court of appeals denied his appeal. Mr. Von Brunn ultimately served 6.5 years in prison for that crime. You know, it was just April of this year when the Extremism and Radicalization branch of the Department of Homeland Security's Threat Analysis Division released its report on potential threats from right-wing extremists. This followed a similar group about left-wing extremists, but conservatives nevertheless went nuts over that report. They demanded that it be retracted, which it was, and they demanded that Secretary Janet Napolitano apologize for it, which she did. As recently as last week, Secretary Napolitano was called before the House Homeland Security Committee, and ranking Republican Peter King demanded that she further apologize for that report. Now, within less than 2 weeks, we've seen two fatal shootings in which the prime suspect is quite clearly motivated by extreme right-wing political views, exactly what the report was warning about. Is the overall threat of extreme right-wing violence in America getting worse? Is there a risk that this shooting and that the Dr. George Tiller shooting in Kansas will embolden others who are already on the edge? Joining us now is Mark Weitzman. He's director of the Task Force Against Hate and Terrorism at the Simon Wiesenthal Center. Mr. Weitzman, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me here, Rachel.
Was James Von Brunn at all on your radar before today's shooting?
Yes, he was, in the sense that he was a name that we had come across. We had seen his materials online. We had read some of his works, etc. But he was not a high-profile person in the movement. He was not a leader of any particular band. He was 89 years old, 88 years old. He had basically been someone who was crying around for himself. We had links. We had seen him back in the 1980s, for example, appearing on a Holocaust denial website based in Toronto, Canada. So his links have gone back quite a while, but he never really seemed to be a person that was going to create this kind of fuss and do something that would end so tragically.
Much like in the abortion rights movement, there are those in not only the Jewish community, but also in other civil rights communities who track these right-wing groups independently, beyond what the government does. Why is that?
Well, I think that certainly for us, clearly there's an imperative that came out of the Holocaust, a sense of to know what is going on out there that can pose a threat, that can pose a danger. We take these people very seriously. Even though Van Brun did not appear to be someone with the possibility, potential of violence, the type of activity that we saw today, the lesson of Timothy McVeigh, for example, who prototype of the lone wolf, which is someone who flies below the radar screen, someone who's not well known, and yet precisely because of that has the ability to put together an act, something that we all took very seriously. It really just takes one person who is seriously committed to these kind of ideals and has a propensity or ability to act violently to create a tragedy, as we saw today.
Well, for people who aren't leaders, but who are active in anti-government and extremist and sort of hate circles, what is the connection between people like this who have clearly threatened violence, Mr. Van Brun had, Mr. Roeder in the George Tiller killing had, and groups that are also extremist but do not overtly promote violence? It has been suggested that those groups may, although they may be anti-government, they may not have sympathy for the groups that they organize against, they may have more responsibility than anybody else simply because of their opportunities to get information from these people. They may have more responsibility than any other Americans to literally turn people in when they hear threats of overt violence, when they know about people bragging about criminal mischief, criminal damage. Do you think that's an appropriate line of attack?
I would hope that anyone who has knowledge of this kind of activity, of someone who's planning to take law into their own hands or act violently, targeting other people for harm, would act as a responsible citizen and would do something about it. And that cuts across the board and every kind, for the whole broad political spectrum. Here we're talking about the denial of the most basic human right, which is the right to live. And threats like that need to be met directly. If anyone knows of someone planning something of that, they really should be turning it into law enforcement. They really should be acting about it. And there's responsibility as well in terms of monitoring rhetoric and moderating rhetoric. We've turned, particularly with the internet, we saw how much Van Brun used the internet, for example. He's not the only one. There are 10,000 databases on our website. 10,000 websites on our database that we are taking a look at. And the rhetoric keeps ratcheting up. People keep calling for violence. People are looking, particularly in a climate that we have now of economic turmoil, of a first minority and African-American president of the United States. People see this as a tipping point. They're ready to act. And unfortunately today we saw something like that.
Mark Weitzman, Director of the Task Force Against Hate and Terrorism at the Simon Wiesenthal Center. Thank you for your work and your contributions really to the country for monitoring this stuff, and thanks for joining us tonight to talk about it.
And thank you for opening up the discourse on this.
Absolutely. Still ahead this hour,